We're going to open the floor to questions, and we do have microphones available so that you can ask.
If you could pick 2 or 3 policy prescriptions necessary to get the growth that Indonesia wants over the next 10 years, what would be those 2 or 3 recommendations you would have for a country like Indonesia?
I think on macroeconomic policy, they've got some pretty good macroeconomic policymakers, so I don't worry about that. I think, linked to what I just said about John, I think education, there is a very basic need, and particularly at the tertiary need, for considerable efforts in education, and that's not something that's going to be able to influence the next few weeks, but certainly the next, if they're really going to extract the demographic dividend, that's, in my opinion, number 1. Number 2, linked to what I said about FDI, work on what is your thing, what is it you've got to offer the world that nobody else has got, away from commodities. Because if they don't, they will be forever dependent on the world commodity cycle and the Fed's monetary policies. And the third thing that goes with it, it is a very young country in terms of democracy, arguably only since '98 in some ways. And I think more self-confidence in the governance of its organisations, which ties probably to some aspects of the corruption issue, I think that's a pretty important thing as well.
Please.
I want to add, look, I mean, if you take a look at our trade account, I think it tells you the full picture. We import too much oil. We import, I mean, that's what's causing the trade deficit and the current account deficit. The game changes in the oil industry. If we can produce more than the 830,000 barrels a day worth of production to fulfill the 1.3 million barrels a day demand. And we've got enough wells and deposits to fulfill that. The second is the low-hanging fruits of manufacturing products, which we import so many and so much of from China and the other Asian countries. These are stuff that I think Indonesian high school graduates and polytechnics can make. And all it does require is a set of fiscal incentives, which I think the government could pretty easily figure out, which we've tried. We've done since 2 years ago. We've started giving out tax holidays and tax allowances. And the third is really corruption. Corruption, I think, takes 1% to 2% of our growth. All we got to do is improve the ratio of the investigators to the public officials. The ratio of the investigators to the public officials is 100 investigators to 4.5 public officials in a country. So that's 1 to 45,000. Hong Kong took 30 years to eradicate corruption, and they had a ratio of 1 to 200 in terms of the number of investigators to the number of public officials. And this requires fiscal thinking, and I think we can afford. The last bit, it's the fiscal space that we can create a lot more of. There's only 20 million people in companies paying taxes. There's a lot of people hiding in the bushes that are not paying taxes. So we can do something about that.
Is there an empty bush I can go hide behind?
Well,
or?
no, I wasn't suggesting anything to you, Ron. But we can quite easily improve our tax ratio of 15.5% to perhaps 20%. If we can do that, we would have a lot more fiscal space to get a lot more people to get PhDs, masters, bachelor's degrees, and what have you. That would be our long-term game plan. But the short and midterm, I think it's very clear. We just got to make motorcycles in Indonesia and handphones in Indonesia. There's 250 million people that will demand them.
Jean-Claude, if a President Gita were to call you and say, what do we need to do on the monetary
President of Lippo.
For the monetary policy, I would say you would not be surprised. Be sound and reasonable. Know that you have to anchor solidly your inflation expectations. And it is true for the advanced economy as well as for the emerging world. And if you stabilize your inflation expectations, medium and long run, you are really helping even much more than you think growth, sustainable growth in the country. And let me say, conclude on that, what has happened under the crisis in the advanced economy has not been observed sufficiently. All countries that are issuing the currencies of the SDR have now the same definition of price stability. We say less than 2, but close to 2. The US has said in 2012, 2%. Japan has said in 2013, 2%. And the UK is in monetary targeting at 2%. All currencies of the SDR, 2%, which says a lot also on the help they think will be associated with stabilizing the long-term, medium-term inflation expectations in order to avoid the deflation, which is a danger, obviously, as well as inflation, of course, in the longer run. But again, sound monetary policy are of the essence, sir.
Jean-Claude, I can't resist one. Does that mean for China to become part of the SDR, they have to adopt a 2% inflation target?
We will see when time comes. There are a number of other conditions for China to join the club. But, I mean, it would be something like,
4%.
one of these criteria, you could imagine.
Yes, and over there. Hold on 1 second. We'll get you a microphone so that you can be heard.
Zubin said that over 50 years, from 62 till 2013, and this question is addressed to you, Jim, the Latin American countries have not made any progress with their per capita as a percentage of the US. It has stayed flat at around 25%. But in Asia, the emerging markets, the countries have gone from about 12% to about 40% of American per capita GDP. What do you think explains this great variation?
Well, I don't think, if there's anybody from Chile in the room, I don't think all Latin American people would be in agreement with that. Chile has made considerable progress in the past 20 years.
Just look at it as a whole club, all of Asia and all of Latin America.
I mean, personally, there's a lot of really good things going on in Latin America, other than Argentina and maybe aspects of Venezuela. There's a lot of very good things going on in Latin America, in my opinion. Mexico, Colombia, Chile, kind of Brazil, not quite as good as it was. And Brazil, by the way, has made quite a bit of progress and one of the reasons why Lula was so popular, because he raised wealth for so many poor people. I often thought he was the most successful G20 policymaker of the past decade because of how many people he helped take out of poverty in Brazil. However, it is true, but in that sense, I answer you in a slightly indirect way. I have often said, and I've discussed it with these guys and some of their colleagues, that South Korea, in my opinion, is if not a role model, a real example for every major developing country to get on a plane to and go and spend some time. Because they are the only country of more than 40 million people in my lifetime that has taken its wealth to that of a G7 or close to Italy and Spain. And there must be something about that which relates to policy. And some things I still work on developing a new version of what I did at Goldman. It's sort of a scoring system of 18 variables for productivity. South Korea is in the top 10 countries in the world on things like that. Education, use of technology, and openness to trade are the three things which I think many other emerging countries can learn from, whether it be Latin America or elsewhere. And that's one of the reasons I think why Chile is starting to do quite a bit better.
Yeah, Jean-Claude.
No, only I have rescheduled all Latin America countries in the 80s as chairman of the Paris Club. And I have to confirm what Jim was saying. The progress which were made there are really extraordinary and were not foreseen at all. The Mexican growth is striking. And I think that, of course, the figures which were mentioned are not false. But one has to take into account that China and India, which are absolutely gigantic, and perhaps other countries, were starting from a much lower level than Latin America. So I really trust that you have to nuance a little bit. And of course, in Latin America, you have also very bad stories like Argentina. But again, Chile, Mexico, and Brazil, in many respects, are success stories which are very impressive.
Minister Mahendra, with respect to Latin America, in the United States, up until maybe the 1990s, people referred to the region as having infinite potential and always would have. And how does the East, particularly Southeast Asia, avoid that kind of same characterization? I mean, obviously, there's been a great deal of growth, but there is the question of where it caps out or whether or not it continues on in a meaningful and sustainable way.
The different answer to the Asia or East Asia, Southeast Asia story and Latin America is that for East Asia and Southeast Asia story, the sustainability scenario lies on its own region and domestic market, while in Latin America probably its proximity to the US. And this is why I think Asia will become even more important. Now we already contribute to 50% of GDP, but if he goes further, what also happened is that we contribute to about 2/3 of exports and overall international trade, which means on one hand that is good, but on the other hand, it is sensitive and it is not sustainable to repeat the example of the pre-Lehman crisis, where everything was exported to the advanced economies. Advanced economies, despite a cyclical growth of 2%, 3%, is by definition a saturated, mature market. While Asia, as I thought earlier, is an issue of 110% increase of middle income group between 8 years. So we have the much more sustainable growth story within Asia, and this is the issue of intra-regional and domestic consumption. And this is where I think every Asian nations try to adjust their old China, old US story to the new China, new US stories, where consumption will become more important, and intra-regional openness, trade and investment will become the determining factor.
Mr. Gita, so as you look forward over the next year, the things that keep you up at night, these are the types of things that, maybe we've touched on, maybe we haven't, but the things that you worry about most with respect to sustaining economic growth, to creating structural reforms, and then also what you worry about in other parts of the world. Where is your mind most focused these days?
Jim picked up on South Korea. Let's not forget, South Korea was not one of the most open economies in the early 70s. They had the advantage of not being a WTO member at that time. But they did a lot of things right. And what the first thing that they did was to basically come out with an agrarian law. And that's what Japan did, what Taiwan did, and China did. And this is something that I think Indonesia needs to do firsthand. We got to make sure that we can put food on the table for ourselves. And there's been an increasing amount of importation of agricultural products into Indonesia, and this is something that I think we need to take a view on. And number two, we need to make sure and ensure the farmers that they have the ability to cultivate the land for themselves, for their kids and grandkids, so that it's not going to be built malls on and golf courses and whatever. We have more than 40 million farmers in Indonesia. And I think when we're talking about food, it's not just about food security. It's more about food sovereignty. The fertility of our land, I think, is enough, for us to believe that we can achieve that. Now, when we achieve that, then we can start thinking of ourselves as an industrial country. Now we have to start from the basics, the basic stuff that we talked about earlier, before we get into the high-tech stuff that what China, Taiwan, and Japan are already doing, or South Korea. So agrarian, I think, is really a top priority for me, and hopefully for most Indonesians.
Minister Mahendra, with respect to that, I mean, there are agricultural powerhouses in the world that think quite differently than Minister Gita. They want to export, whether it's genetically modified foods that are developed in the United States, may or may not have some resonance in other parts of the world. But this issue of farming has been actually debated globally since the 1980s. I remember in 1986, before the WTO at the GATT, we were talking about subsidies, we were talking about deals, and yet there is really no comprehensive global situation that addresses agriculture. Is it partly also incumbent upon the rest of the world to work some of these problems out before you can become fully self-sufficient at home in that regard?
Yes, I think it's very clear. On one hand, every nation would like to have a food security strategy and their priority. But then if you put the overall international trade and investment picture into it, then of course it is very challenging to have individual food security issue and overall global food security situation. I think we have to change the mindset that in the past what happened is that emerging economies, developing countries, part of the food value chain is always from the production side, and then when farmers produce it and then export it raw, and then of course expect the prices would improve. But what happened is always the story of high risk volatility of prices, because they are in the worst part of the equation, while of course the consumers from the advanced markets would dictate the prices volatility according to the business cycle. But again, this doesn't have to be the story permanently. We have the potential to develop our own story where the whole value chain will take place in the country and in the region, where we can hopefully rewrite the history much better than the rest of the story that we know very much, how subsidy played the whole situation of agriculture in many countries, not to mention this region, creates disturbances and distortions. And I think this is where the lesson learned of the old world, if I can say, is that of just the old US, the old world story, to put it into the new world story in much better frame.
Jim, with respect to the next year, if we were to reconvene the same panel 12 months from now, what do you think we'd be talking about compared to today?
I hope relates to the sort of three issues that concern me and my general optimism. I hope we would not be talking about the following three. But whilst it's easy for China to reduce the importance of the old China, to create the new China requires delivering on a lot of really good things to say. So I hope we see some evidence of that actually appearing more this year. Secondly, I don't like the tone of some of the comments going on across the waters between them and Japan. I assume that the importance of the economic relationship is such that it stops them getting a bit too emotional. And then thirdly, actually, something for Jean-Claude to focus on. I worry about his old job and his successor. ECB has an inflation target of just below 2%. Given the challenges facing some of the periphery, they are only going to be able to succeed in reaching that if Germany somehow can accept inflation going above 2%. It bothers me that there's something in the German psyche that they can't.
Jean-Claude, final word to you. With respect to that, Christine Lagarde in the last week has suggested that still the biggest threat to the global economy, particularly the developed global economy, is deflation. Is that something with which you agree, and is there more work to be done on that front?
I think it is one of the threats. I'm not sure that it is the only one, obviously. But on that particular point, I would say, first of all, during all the crises, there has been threats of materialization of a deflationary risk in the United States. When you look at the inflation expectations, they were at certain time below zero. In the case of Europe, fortunately, even if we went down and up and down, we never lost the anchoring of inflation expectations. I'm back to what I said. It's extremely important to be solidly anchored. It's very good that the central banks have been clear in saying we have on the one hand the liquidity measures and on the other hand the interest rate policy. I always was a strong advocate of separating the two instruments, because if you join the two, then you risk that the start of tapering would increase market interest rates dramatically, or the reverse. You have to continue to have a separate handling of both, in my opinion, and it is more or less what is accepted by the market now, because I see tapering going on and the interest rates not being influenced now. I mean, it was a painful exercise, but it's done and it's good.
All right. Please join me in thanking Jim O'Neill, Minister Mahendra, Minister Gita, Jean-Claude Trichet. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
I think the important thing is to make sure that these economies grow in a sustainable way.
The main challenge right now is we've got to figure out a way to create more job growth for the lower and middle class. And I think this is going to be a huge challenge for Asia, as it is, frankly, in the United States.
There is an impact of the tapering off to the emerging market. But on the other hand, with the improvement of the U.S. economy, this will also boost our export. So the most important one, as I said to you, that how the emerging market do their homework regarding this improvement on the supply side, like infrastructure, ease doing business, improvement of the investment climate.
The biggest challenge for Indonesian government that need to be addressed, I think they need to come out with very firm regulation. So people are concerned when they investing $100 billion into the industry. Without a structural reform, I think Indonesia will continue to be lag behind.